Wyoming, 1881. The town feared she'd bring back the outlaw, and whispers carried through the chapel walls like smoke from a dying fire. The few faces in the pews were not of welcome, but of cold fear directed at the bride, each gaze a judgment, each murmur a stone thrown at her back. Have you ever felt like the whole world was against you? This is the story of a woman who dared to find her place. Stay with us until the end. The pews sat nearly empty while Clara wept at the altar, forced into marriage vows with a cowboy she barely knew. This wasn't love. This was survival. Her aunt's desperate plea, the town's mounting pressure. A woman alone in this harsh land was prey to wolves, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged devils that rode the territory. Samuel stood there, hat in his calloused hands, watching tears stream down her face. He leaned close and whispered words that would haunt them both. "I'll wait for the day I see joy in your eyes." She looked up through her tears, feeling the weight of that gold band, the silence between them deeper than any canyon. But even as they spoke those sacred vows, shadows moved in the back of the chapel. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm, whispering urgent words that cut through the ceremony like a blade. What if Elias finds out she's married? What if he comes for her here? The preacher's voice wavered. He'd heard the stories, too. Every soul in Wyoming Territory knew the name Elias Crow, and they knew what happened to those who crossed his path. They left the chapel to the sound of wind scraping against weathered wood. Clara gripped her shawl tight, that ring heavy on her finger like a chain. Samuel guided the wagon without a word, reins loose in his hands, eyes scanning the horizon for riders that might be following. The silence stretched between them like barbed wire until Samuel asked, hesitant as a man approaching a spooked horse, "You hungry?" Clara shook her head, couldn't find her voice. He nodded once and kept his eyes on the trail ahead. But both of them were thinking the same dark thought. How long before trouble found them? By nightfall, the wagon stopped before a weather-beaten cabin nestled under a ridge. The fence sagged, the roof bore old scars, and thin smoke drifted from the chimney. It wasn't much of a house, but it stood against the wind. No one came out to greet them, just the creak of the cabin door when Samuel pushed it open. Clara stepped inside for the first time, breathing air thick with wood smoke and dust and fear. Samuel lit a lantern, set down his hat, pointed to the table. "There's bread," he said simply. Clara sat rigid, hands folded in her lap, wondering if this place could ever feel like anything more than a hideout. She forced down a few bites, more to fill the silence than her stomach. Samuel ate slowly, quietly, never pressing her with questions or false comfort. Only once did she catch his eyes on her, steady but unreadable, like a man studying storm clouds on the horizon. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled through the darkness, carrying secrets and threats in equal measure. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that hungry eyes were already watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before Wyoming, Clara had known only loss. Her mother passed when she was 12, leaving behind a music box and the echo of forgotten lullabies. Her father followed 5 years later, taking with him the last crumbs of safety she'd ever known. But Clara had survived worse than grief. She'd survived being hunted. 2 years back, in Cedar Falls, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes had decided she belonged to him. Elias Crow didn't take kindly to the word no. For 3 days, he'd stalked her through dusty streets, whistling that slow, haunting tune that still woke her in cold sweats. She'd run to the church, barricaded herself inside, while Crow prowled outside like a wolf circling wounded prey. The preacher had begged him to leave, but Crow just kept whistling, waiting, promising in that snake oil voice, "I'll be back for what's mine, little schoolmarm. Count on it." 2 nights after he rode out, the small, struggling orphanage that had given Clara a room burned to the ground. No one died, but the message was clear as the ash that covered the town. Defying Elias Crow had consequences, a lesson etched not just in ashes, but in the hearts of those who dared to cross him. When he finally rode out, Clara thought she was free. She was wrong. Crow's reputation followed her like a shadow, town to town, job to job. Families would hire her to teach their children, then whisper behind closed doors about the danger she might bring to their doorstep. "That's the woman Elias Crow has his eye on," they'd say. "Best send her along before he comes calling." Doors slammed in her face. Children she'd grown to love were kept from her lessons. Parents paid her half wages and begged her to move on. Clara learned that sometimes being a victim was worse than being forgotten, because victims attract predators. Samuel Reed knew loneliness, like most men knew hard work. 32 years old, eating alone at tables built for two, sleeping in beds that felt wide as the prairie itself. His father had died owing money to the wrong people, and now Samuel carried those debts like rocks in his saddlebags. Mr. Hargrove, the town banker, never let him forget it. "Some men are born to prosper, Samuel," he'd say with that oil-slick smile. "Others are born to drag debts behind them like tin cans on a dog's tail." The old man took pleasure in Samuel's struggles, reminding everyone in town that the Reed family owed more than they could pay. But what Hargrove didn't say, what nobody knew, was that those original loans had been a trap from the start. High interest, impossible terms, designed to keep Samuel's father desperate and borrowing more. Now Samuel worked sunrise to sunset, trying to chip away at a mountain of debt that seemed to grow taller each month. But a man can only work so hard, so long, before he starts talking to the wind and wondering if he'll die as alone as he lived. When Clara's Aunt Margaret came calling with her desperate proposal, Samuel saw more than just a chance to help an old woman who'd once saved his family from starvation. He saw a possibility, maybe the only one he'd ever get. "The girl needs protection," Margaret had said, her hands shaking as she poured him coffee, "and you need—" She'd paused, searching for words that wouldn't wound his pride. "You need someone to make this ranch feel like more than just a place where dreams go to die." Samuel had accepted, not for love, not yet, but for the hope that two broken people might somehow make one whole life. The morning of the wedding, he'd polished his boots and straightened his best hat, not because he expected happiness, but because he believed in keeping promises, even promises made to old women and desperate girls. But as he stood at that altar, watching Clara weep like her heart was breaking, Samuel made a silent vow that went deeper than the words the preacher spoke. He'd protect her from whatever demons chased her across the territory. He'd stand between her and the world if that's what it took, even if it killed him. Because sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to lose for someone else. The question that haunted them both as they settled into their first uneasy night as husband and wife was simple. Would love be enough when Elias Crow came calling? Or would their marriage vows become nothing more than words carved on matching headstones? Outside their cabin, the Wyoming wind carried more than cold air. It carried whispers of a man with a scarred face and a long memory, riding closer with each passing day. And in the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, though there wasn't a cloud in the star-filled sky. That sound wasn't thunder at all. It was hoofbeats. Elias Crow was coming home. The banging on their door came 3 days after the wedding, sharp and angry as gunshots in the morning stillness. Clara was washing dishes when the sound shattered their fragile peace. Her hands froze in the soapy water, every muscle in her body going tight as a piano wire. Samuel set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, but she caught the way his eyes flicked to the rifle hanging above the mantel. "Reed, open this door." Clara recognized the voice. Thompson, the rancher who'd been decent enough at the wedding. But there was nothing decent in his tone now. It carried the weight of a mob's anger, the kind that builds overnight and explodes at dawn. Samuel moved to the window first, peering through the thin curtain. 3 men, he said quietly. Thompson, Morrison, and that young Harper boy. His jaw tightened. All armed. The banging came again, harder this time. "We know you're in there, Reed. We need to talk." Samuel straightened his shoulders, checked his sidearm, and walked to the door. But before he could reach for the handle, Clara stepped between him and the threshold. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If they see me, if they think about what I might bring to this town." "They'll have to go through me first," Samuel said, but his voice carried doubt. 3 armed men weren't odds any smart gambler would take. He opened the door anyway. Thompson stood on the porch, hat in hand, but fury in his eyes. Morrison flanked him to the left, rifle loose in his grip but ready to move. Young Harper looked nervous, like a boy playing at being dangerous, which made him the most dangerous of all. "Morning, Thompson," Samuel said, keeping his voice level as still water. "Nothing good about it," Thompson replied, his breath steaming in the cold air. "We've got a problem, Reed. A big one." "Speak your piece." Thompson's eyes flicked past Samuel to where Clara stood in the shadows of the doorway. When he looked back at Samuel, there was something like pity in his expression. "Riders came through Morrison's place yesterday evening, 3 of them, asking questions." Thompson shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the message he'd come to deliver. "They wanted to know about new folks in town. Specifically, they wanted to know about your wife." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Samuel's hand moved instinctively closer to his gun. "What kind of questions?" Samuel asked. "The wrong kind," Morrison spoke up, his voice rough as tree bark. "Questions about whether she was pretty, whether she was available, whether her husband might be the type to put up a fight or the type to hand her over quiet-like." "They didn't just ask, Reed. They left a warning. Found my prize heifer mutilated this morning, its ear carved off and left hanging on my fence post. A message, plain as day, for anyone harboring what Elias considers his property. This ain't just talk, Reed. This is Crow." Young Harper stepped forward, trying to make his voice sound older than his 20 years. "They described her perfect, Reed, right down to that scar on her left hand from when she was a child. These weren't strangers asking random questions." Clara looked down at her hand, at the thin white line that ran from her thumb to her wrist, a mark from a childhood accident that only someone who'd studied her closely would notice, someone who'd been close enough to grab her hand, close enough to hurt her. Elias Crow. "They say anything else?" Samuel's voice had gone quiet, the way voices do before violence. Thompson nodded grimly, said they'd be back, said they were just scouting, making sure the lay of the land was right for what they had planned. "And what exactly do they have planned?" Samuel asked, though Clara could see in his eyes that he already knew. "They're coming for her, Reed." Thompson's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "And when they do, anyone standing in their way is going to get hurt. That means you. That means your neighbors. That means families with children who have done nothing wrong except live too close to the woman Elias Crow has marked as his." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 3 men's stares pressing down on her like gravestones. Finally, Morrison cleared his throat. "We're not heartless people, Reed. We know she didn't ask for this trouble, but trouble's coming whether she asked for it or not." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel's voice had turned to winter. Young Harper spoke up again, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "Maybe she could go visit family back east for a while. just until things cool down, until Crow loses interest and moves on. "I don't have family back east," Clara said quietly, stepping out of the shadows. All three men turned to look at her, and she saw fear flash across their faces. Not fear of her, but fear of what her presence meant for their own wives and children. "Then somewhere else," Thompson said, his voice softer now that he was speaking directly to her. "Anywhere else. We'll take up a collection, help with travel money, but ma'am, you can't stay here. Not if you care about what happens to innocent folks when Crow comes calling." Clara felt Samuel's hand touch her back, warm and steady, but she could sense the tension in his fingers. He was calculating odds, measuring distances to weapons, preparing for a fight he might not be able to win. "She stays," Samuel said finally. "This is her home now, our home." Thompson shook his head sadly. "Then you're condemning us all, Reed. And when children die because you were too stubborn to face facts, their blood will be on your hands and hers." The three men turned to leave, but Thompson paused at the edge of the porch. "You've got 48 hours to make the right choice," he said. "After that, the town's going to make it for you." As their horses' hooves faded into the distance, Clara and Samuel stood in their doorway, watching dust settle on the path that led away from their small sanctuary. For the first time since their wedding, Clara wasn't the only one who felt afraid. The isolation had begun. The change started with spilled coffee and a curse word that would have made a saloon keeper blush. It was Tuesday morning when Clara burned her hand on the hot pot and let loose with language she'd learned from a Denver teamster. Samuel, who was mending harness leather near the door, looked up with genuine surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Sorry," she muttered, wrapping her hand in a dish towel. "Don't apologize," he said, and for the first time since their wedding, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Heard worse from my horses?" It was a small crack in the wall between them, but sometimes small cracks are all you need to let the light in. Over the following days, Samuel began to speak more than just the necessary words. He'd comment on the weather, mention cattle that needed moving to fresh pasture, talk about the fence that wouldn't survive another winter. Clara found herself responding, and slowly their conversation stretched beyond mere survival. But it was when Samuel found her struggling with his mother's old loom that something deeper began to shift. "Been gathering dust for 5 years," he said, kneeling beside her in the small parlor. "Mama always said every person should know how to mend what's broken." His hands, rough from rope and leather, moved with surprising gentleness as he untangled the snarled threads. Clara watched his fingers work, noticing the small scars that mapped years of hard labor, the careful patience he brought to the delicate task. "She taught you this?" Clara asked. "Said a man who couldn't repair what was damaged wasn't much of a man at all," Samuel replied, guiding Clara's hands through the proper motion. "Slow and steady, no need to rush." When their fingers accidentally touched, neither pulled away immediately. The contact lasted only seconds, but Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest, the first warmth that wasn't born of fear or desperation. As Clara learned the rhythm of the loom, she began sharing pieces of her former life. Not the dark parts, not yet, but the memories that still held light. She told him about teaching children to read in a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas, about the boy who carved horses in his desk margins, about the girl who memorized every poem Clara ever shared. "What happened to them?" Samuel asked one evening, cleaning his rifle while Clara worked the loom. "Had to leave," Clara said simply. "Couldn't stay anywhere too long. Wasn't safe." Samuel nodded, understanding filling the spaces between her words. "Well, you're not leaving here." One quiet afternoon, while waiting for Samuel outside the general store, Clara watched a group of children huddled near a worn-out broadside, attempting to read the faded words aloud. Their young brows were furrowed in frustration, stumbling over syllables. Clara, remembering her days in the classroom, felt a familiar pull. She moved closer, not intrusively, but with a gentle presence. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet kindness, "when words feel too big, we can break them into smaller sounds. Listen, Wyoming." She pointed to the letters, sounding them out simply. The children's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding lighting their faces. One of them, a timid girl with bright eyes, managed to repeat it, then another. A moment later, Mrs. Henderson, who had stepped out of the store, paused, her usual stern expression softening as she watched the unexpected lesson. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod to Clara before turning away, leaving a lingering sense of surprise in the air. Have you ever found yourself finding strength in unexpected acts of kindness? Leave a comment and share your story. The test of that promise came when Mrs. Callahan arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon. She was a woman built for frontier life, with steel gray hair and hands that had delivered babies, buried husbands, and held communities together through harsh winters. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd earned respect through deed rather than birthright. "Came to meet Samuel's wife, she announced, settling a covered basket on Clara's kitchen table without invitation. Clara tensed, expecting judgment or barely concealed hostility. Instead, Mrs. Callahan studied her with the assessing gaze of a woman who understood survival. "Brought sourdough starter," she said matter-of-factly, "and some herbs. Never know when a woman might need remedies for headaches, or worse troubles." There was meaning in her words that went deeper than cooking advice. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Callahan became Clara's lifeline to normalcy. She taught Clara to bake bread that didn't burn, to brew teas that settled nerves, to identify which prairie plants could heal and which could kill. More importantly, she taught Clara that not all the women in Wyoming had turned their backs on her. "Loneliness is a choice sometimes," Mrs. Callahan said one afternoon, while showing Clara how to preserve vegetables for winter. "You can shut yourself away like a hermit, or you can crack open the door and see what's worth letting in." That evening, when Samuel returned from checking the cattle, he found fresh bread cooling on the counter and stew that smelled like the home he'd never quite managed to create on his own. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand, breathing in aromas that carried more than sustenance. They carried hope. "Smells like—" He stopped, searching for words. "Like home?" Clara offered quietly. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been gratitude. "Like home." They ate in companionable silence, but it was different now. Not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the comfortable peace of two people learning to share space without stepping on each other's wounds. After supper, Samuel didn't disappear immediately to his room. Instead, he stayed to help with dishes, his movements careful around the delicate china that had belonged to his mother. "Clara," he said as they finished the last plate, his voice carrying the weight of words he'd been storing up. "Thank you for trying, for making this feel like more than just a place to sleep." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the stranger who'd agreed to marry her out of duty, but the lonely man who was also trying to find his place in this arrangement that had become their shared life. "Thank you for letting me try," she replied. When he headed upstairs to his room, Clara remained in the kitchen for a few minutes longer, surrounded by clean dishes and the lingering warmth of the stove. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she felt useful rather than tolerated, welcomed rather than endured. Outside, the wind still carried threats across the endless prairie. Somewhere in that darkness, dangerous men were making dangerous plans. But inside this small cabin, two damaged people had taken their first tentative steps toward something that might, someday, resemble healing. Clara touched the wedding ring she'd begun to think of as a burden, and for the first time, it didn't feel quite so heavy. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that their small moments of peace hadn't gone unnoticed. Eyes watched from the ridgeline above their property. A scarred man sat his horse in the darkness, studying the warm light spilling from their windows, making plans of his own. Elias Crow had been patient long enough. Soon he'd remind Clara exactly who she belonged to, and he'd teach her new husband the price of standing between a predator and his prey. The honeymoon, such as it was almost over. It was on a Saturday evening that Samuel heard the crying. He'd come back early from checking the fence line, planning to fix the kitchen door that had been sticking for weeks. The sound drifted from the parlor, soft, broken, like something precious being torn apart. He found Clara on the floor, her back to the doorway, curved over something in her lap, like she was protecting it from the world. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. "Clara?" His voice came out gentler than he'd intended. She turned quickly, trying to hide her tear-streaked face, but she couldn't hide what she held. It was a music box, small and delicate, with wood that had once been polished to a shine. Now one side was cracked, the lid hung at a broken angle, and where a tiny dancer should have spun, only twisted metal remained. "I'm sorry," she whispered, attempting to stand. "I wasn't making noise. I didn't mean to." "You don't need to apologize for grieving." Samuel knelt beside her, his eyes taking in the destroyed keepsake. "Your mother's?" Clara nodded, her fingers tracing the splintered wood. "She'd wind it every night before tucking me in. It played a waltz. I can't remember the name, but I know every note by heart." Her voice cracked. "It broke during one of my moves, in a merchant's wagon. I've tried to fix it, but—" "Can I take a look?" She hesitated, clutching the music box against her chest like a wounded bird. Everything precious in her life had been lost or taken. Trusting someone else with this last piece of her mother felt like stepping off a cliff. "I might be able to help," Samuel said quietly, "but only if you want me to." Something in his tone, not pity, not false comfort, but genuine care, made Clara slowly extend the broken music box toward him. Samuel received it like he was handling something sacred. He examined the mechanism, the cracked wood, the tiny gears that had come loose from their moorings. It was damaged, badly damaged, but not beyond hope, not for someone with patience and the right tools. "I can try," he said finally, "but it'll take time. Might take several evenings." "You would do that?" Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for the catch, the condition, the reason he might change his mind. "Of course." That night, after Clara had gone upstairs, Samuel took the music box to his small workshop behind the house. By lamplight, he carefully dismantled each piece, studying how they fit together, understanding the delicate clockwork that had once brought music and joy to a little girl's bedtime. Night after night he worked, carving a new hinge from seasoned oak, realigning the tiny gears, polishing each component until it gleamed. The melody mechanism was the hardest part. Intricate as a spider's web, fragile as a promise. Clara never asked about his progress. She would glance toward his workshop when she saw the lamp burning late, but she never pressed. It was as if she was afraid that asking might break whatever magic was happening in that small room. On the seventh night, Samuel finally heard it, the soft, sweet notes of a waltz drifting through the darkness. The melody was hesitant at first, then stronger, clearer, not perfect. The music box would always bear the scars of its breaking, but it sang again. The next morning, Clara found the music box on the kitchen table, open with a small note beside it. "So your mother's song won't be forgotten." She approached it like she might approach a wild animal, slowly, afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she touched the key and heard the familiar melody fill the kitchen, she pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. The music wasn't exactly as she remembered. The tempo was slightly different, some notes softer than others. But it was her mother's waltz, restored to life by the careful hands of a man who barely knew her, but had spent 7 nights returning a piece of her heart. When Samuel came in from the morning chores, he found Clara still sitting at the table, the music box playing its gentle song. She wasn't crying now. Instead, she was smiling, the first real smile he'd seen since their wedding day. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight beyond mere gratitude. "I thought I'd lost her forever." Samuel poured himself coffee, trying to appear casual. "Sometimes broken things just need someone who cares enough to put them back together." "Sometimes, don't you think all we really need is someone who cares enough to help us put the pieces back together?" Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. Her touch was warm, deliberate, real. "Is that what you're doing with me?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened woman he'd married out of duty, but someone stronger, someone worth fighting for, someone worth the risk of caring about. "Maybe we're putting each other back together," he said. The music box finished its song and clicked closed with a soft sound that seemed to seal something between them. For the first time since coming to Wyoming, Clara felt truly seen. Not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a woman whose broken pieces might be worth repairing. "Samuel," she said softly, "the promise you made at our wedding about waiting to see joy in my eyes?" He nodded, remembering those words spoken in a nearly empty church to a weeping bride. Clara opened the music box again, letting the waltz fill the space between them. When she looked at him, her eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but the beginning of something that might someday become love. "You don't have to wait much longer," she whispered. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. In the distance, a rider watched their small cabin through a spyglass, his scarred face twisted with rage at the sight of Clara smiling at another man. Elias Crow had seen enough. It was time to remind his little schoolmarm who she really belonged to, and to teach her cowboy husband what happened to men who stole what wasn't theirs. The community meeting had been called to discuss winter preparations, roads needing repair, supplies to be stored, families that might need help. It was an October tradition when everyone gathered in the town hall to plan for the hard months ahead. Clara went alone. Samuel was in the north field where 3 head of cattle had vanished during the night, and he needed to track them before predators got there first. "Shouldn't take long," he'd promised. "If I finish in time, I'll meet you there." The hall was packed when Clara arrived. Women clustered on one side, men on the other, as always happened at these gatherings. She found a spot at the end of a bench between Mrs. Henderson and the blacksmith's wife, who gave her a polite but distant nod. The meeting chairman, a rancher named Thompson, was discussing the need to repair the bridge over the creek when Mr. Hargrove rose from the front row. Tall and well-dressed in his dark suit, with a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. He commanded attention just by standing. "Before we continue," he said, pulling papers from his inner coat pocket, "I believe we should discuss a more urgent matter, a matter that affects the financial stability of our entire community." A murmur rippled through the hall. Thompson frowned. What matter would that be, Hargrove? The banker unfolded the papers with theatrical flourish. The matter of unpaid debts, specifically the Reed family debts that have remained outstanding for years, accumulating interest like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Clara felt her stomach clench. She looked around and saw that many neighbors had turned to stare at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Samuel Reed, Hargrove continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority, inherited from his father a considerable debt. A debt that, I must add, has only grown with time and negligence. He waved the papers. "I have here the records. 5 years of missed payments, compound interest, a sum that would shame any honest man." Samuel works harder than any man in this county, Thompson said, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. Working hard is not the same as paying debts, Hargrove replied with a cold smile. A man who cannot honor what he owes is not a man at all. He's dead weight. And a dead weight like Samuel, refusing to settle his dues, affects all of us. It drives up interest rates for honest folk, creates instability in our fledgling economy, and sends a clear message to outsiders that this town is weak, ripe for picking, by men like, well, by any man who smells easy prey. Nervous laughter echoed from some corners of the hall. Not malicious laughter, necessarily, but the kind that emerges when people feel uncomfortable but don't know how to respond. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. The women beside her shifted uneasily in their seats, avoiding her gaze. Thompson tried to regain control of the meeting, but Hargrove wasn't finished. "I'm not being cruel," he continued, folding the papers and tucking them away again. "I'm being realistic. This community cannot prosper carrying those who refuse to carry their own weight. We all know some men simply aren't born to succeed. Some are born only to drag debts behind them like chains." The silence that followed was thick as molasses. Clara could hear her own breathing, the creak of floorboards when someone shifted position, the wind rattling the hall's windows. It was in that silence that she stood. Every head turned toward her. Clara had never spoken at a community meeting before. Women rarely spoke unless directly questioned. But she stood anyway, her legs trembling slightly, her voice steady when she found the words. "You call him weak," she said, looking straight at Hargrove, "because he can't pay his father's debts." The banker raised his eyebrows, surprised by the interruption. Clara drew a deep breath and continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I call him strong because he still works, still fights, even when so many here whisper the uncomfortable truth. Afraid to say it out loud that these debts were built on injustice, a scheme to trap honest men from the very beginning." A shock wave passed through the hall. Mrs. Henderson let out an audible gasp. The blacksmith leaned forward in his seat. Even Thompson seemed surprised by the young teacher's sudden courage. "Injustice?" Hargrove repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Yeah," Clara said, lifting her chin. "Everyone knows Samuel's father was tricked into these debts, that the interest was predatory from the start, that a desperate man was taken advantage of by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Murmurs began racing through the hall, some approving, others shocked by her audacity. Hargrove turned red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Don't I work beside Samuel Reed every single day?" Clara continued, her voice now strong enough to reach every corner of the hall. "I see a man who rises before dawn and works past sunset, who mends fences with his own hands, who tends cattle with patience, who never wastes a penny or a scrap of food. I see a man who inherited not just debts, but the honor of trying to pay them, even knowing they were unjust from the beginning." She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of neighbors she knew only by sight, people who had whispered about her but never truly known her. "You want to talk about dead weight?" Her voice carried a passion that surprised even herself. "Then talk about who really profits from others' misery. Talk about who grows fat on this community's problems instead of helping solve them." The silence that followed was different from before. Not discomfort now, but something closer to respect. People who had never really noticed Clara now watched her with new attention. Mrs. Callahan, seated near the front, nodded approvingly. Even some of the men whispered among themselves as if seeing Samuel's wife in an entirely new light. But Clara wasn't finished. Something had awakened in her, a fire she'd kept buried for too long. "And while we're speaking truths," she said, her voice ringing clear, "let's speak about the real reason for tonight's sudden concern about debts and burdens." She paused, letting her words settle. How convenient that this discussion comes just as whispers reach town about unwanted visitors. How convenient that fear makes people look for someone to blame. A new kind of silence fell. Everyone knew what she meant without her saying the name. Elias Crow's shadow had been hanging over the community for weeks. Perhaps, Clara continued, some people profit when fear divides neighbors. Perhaps some people find opportunity in others' terror. Or Hargrove's face had gone from red to pale. He opened and closed his mouth several times, but for once the silver-tongued banker had no ready response to such a public challenge. Thompson, sensing the moment, quickly steered the discussion back to winter preparations. But Clara knew something fundamental had changed. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she didn't feel invisible or rejected. She felt seen, heard, respected. When the meeting ended, several people approached her. Mrs. Callahan squeezed her arm with pride. The pastor's wife commented that Clara had spoken with true courage. Even some of the men tipped their hats respectfully as they passed. But not everyone approved. She caught hostile glances from Hargrove's supporters, heard whispered comments about uppity women and troublemakers. The community was dividing, and she had forced them to choose sides. Clara left the hall with her heart still pounding, but with something new growing in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged to something larger than her own survival. She felt like she had a voice worth hearing. What she didn't know was that her public defense of Samuel had been witnessed by more than just the townspeople. Outside the hall's windows, in the shadows between buildings, other eyes had watched and listened. Eyes that belonged to men who made their living in darkness. Men who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Men who now knew that the little schoolteacher had found her voice and her courage. Soon they would test just how much courage she really possessed. The letter appeared on a Monday morning, folded and left on their doorstep like a death sentence. Samuel found it when he went out to feed the horses, and Clara knew immediately from his expression that it wasn't good news. He unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning words written in careless handwriting. Then he looked up at Clara, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup in her hands. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Samuel folded the letter again, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Nothing to worry about." But Clara knew him well enough now to recognize the lie. After breakfast, when he left to check the fences, she found the letter on his dresser. The words were simple, direct, terrifying. "The little teacher still remember my whistle? Soon she'll hear it again. And this time, there ain't no church to hide in." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Clara sank heavily onto Samuel's bed, the letter trembling in her hands. Crow was back, or at least close enough to threaten. The fear she thought she'd left behind returned like a cold wave, tightening her chest and clouding her vision. That afternoon, while Samuel worked in the field, Clara heard the whistling. It came at sunset, when shadows stretched across the prairie and the wind carried sounds from distant places. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the familiar melody drifted through the open window. It wasn't a cheerful tune. It was the kind of slow, taunting whistle Crow had used to torment her 2 years before. Clara dropped the spoon she was holding. The metal clattered to the floor, echoing through the silent house. Her legs failed her, and she gripped the counter to keep from falling, her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The whistling stopped, then started again, closer now, coming from the direction of the barn. Clara forced herself to move to the window, her hands shaking as she pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. She saw no one, just shadows dancing between the buildings, horses restless in the pasture, wind stirring the dry grass. But the whistling continued, as if it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. When Samuel returned from the field, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. "He was here," she said without preamble. Samuel dropped his hat on the chair, his expression immediately serious. "You saw him?" "I heard the whistling." "That whistling?" Her voice came out weaker than she intended. "He wants me to know he's close." Samuel knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. "I won't let anything happen to you." "How can you be sure?" The words came out harsher than she meant. "You weren't even here." The sting was visible in Samuel's face, but he didn't pull back. "I'll stay closer to the house, and we'll talk to the sheriff." "The sheriff is 2 days' ride from here. And even if he was in town, what would he do? Arrest someone for whistling? Keeg." Samuel had no answer for that, and they both knew it. But the whistling was just the beginning. In town, fear spread like wildfire through dry grass. Mrs. Henderson swore she'd seen a strange silhouette near her property. The blacksmith reported that some of his tools had vanished during the night. Families started locking their doors earlier, and men went back to carrying guns, even for simple tasks. And through it all, Mr. Hargrove watched with barely concealed satisfaction. "I warned them," he told anyone who would listen, adjusting his glasses while counting money at the bank. "Said that trouble never comes alone. Now everyone's paying the price for harboring those who attract misfortune." He didn't need to mention names. Everyone knew who he meant. But Hargrove wasn't content with just comments. He began making strategic visits to families around town, offering emergency loans for anyone wanting to reinforce their properties or buy extra weapons. The interest was high, the terms rigid, but fear made people sign papers without reading them carefully. "It's a matter of safety," he explained in his oily voice. "And safety has no price, does it?" It was Mrs. Callahan who first grew suspicious. Hargrove seemed far too prepared for this crisis, almost like he knew it was coming. "Weeks ago I saw him talking to an outsider behind the bank, a man who didn't belong anywhere and carried the kind of silence that speaks volumes, and a scar not easily forgotten. And not long after, the rumors about footsteps and hauntings started spreading. Strangely convenient, don't you think?" Samuel leaned forward. "You think Hargrove—" "I think that man has been profiting from our misery for years," Mrs. Callahan said flatly, "and I think he's not above creating misery when it doesn't appear naturally." The revelation was shocking but made sense. Hargrove gained in 2 ways. Financially, because desperate families turned to his predatory loans, and politically, because fear established him as the only real authority figure in the community. The more people feared, the more power he accumulated. "He's been planning this," Clara whispered, the pieces falling into place. "Using Crow to terrorize everyone, then swooping in as the solution." "But why target you specifically?" Samuel asked. Mrs. Callahan's expression darkened. "Because Clara spoke against him publicly. Because she showed people they don't have to cower before his authority. Men like Hargrove can't tolerate that kind of challenge." The attacks escalated. 3 nights after the letter, Clara woke to find their fence posts knocked down, the cattle scattered across the prairie. Samuel spent the entire next day rounding them up, leaving Clara alone at the house. That's when she found the second message, carved into their kitchen door with a knife. "Soon." The single word sent ice through her veins. But not everything was darkness. In the days following the community meeting, Clara began noticing subtle changes. A child waved at her on Main Street, smiling openly instead of hiding behind her mother. The pastor's wife stopped to chat about the weather, genuinely asking how she was adapting to ranch life. "You spoke well at the meeting, sir," the woman said. "Many of us have thought the same things, but never had the courage to say them." Other families also began approaching. Farmer Thompson appeared at the ranch one morning to discuss the possibility of Clara teaching his children during winter. "The children need to learn to read properly," he explained, turning his hat in his hands, "and you seem to know what you're doing." It was as if Clara's public defense of Samuel had broken an invisible barrier. People began seeing her not as the woman who brought trouble, but as someone who had courage to face injustice. Even so, the tension grew. Crow's whistling returned twice more. Once during the afternoon when Clara was alone hanging laundry, another time at dawn, waking both her and Samuel. It was a war of nerves, a cruel game of cat and mouse. Samuel began sleeping with his rifle beside the bed. Clara checked door and window locks 3 times before retiring. Both knew Crow was close, waiting for the right moment to make his final move. "Why doesn't he just attack?" Clara asked one night after another episode of phantom whistling. Samuel considered the question in the darkness of their room. Because he enjoys the fear, and because he knows the longer we wait, the more worn down we'll become. "He's right," Clara admitted. "I can barely sleep, can barely think straight." "He won't win," Samuel said with conviction. "Not this time." Clara wanted to believe him, but as the wind howled outside and shadows danced across the bedroom wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. Crow's personal threat and Hargrove's collective manipulation were merging into a single sinister force, testing not just Clara and Samuel's courage, but the very fiber of the community that was slowly beginning to accept them. It was a fight for more than safety or respect. It was a fight for the soul of the town itself. And in the distance, watching through a spyglass from the ridge above their property, a scarred man smiled in the darkness. Soon he would remind his little school teacher exactly who she belonged to, and teach her cowboy husband the price of stealing what wasn't his. The game was almost over, time to collect his prize. Elias Crow chose a Saturday morning for his grand entrance. He knew it would be when the most people were in town, when families came in from the ranches to buy supplies and trade news. He wanted an audience for his show. Clara and Samuel were just leaving the general store when they heard the first scream. A child pointed down Main Street, where a lone rider moved slowly toward the town center. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking who it was. The town seemed to freeze in place. People spilled out of shops and houses, gathering in nervous clusters along the wooden sidewalks. Women pulled their children close. Men instinctively touched the weapons they carried. The air grew thick with expectation and dread. Clara felt her legs turn to water. The last time she'd seen that scarred face was 2 years ago in Cedar Falls, when he'd stalked her through dusty streets until she'd barricaded herself in the church. Now he was here, in Wyoming, because of her. Samuel's hand found her arm steady and warm. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Crow dismounted in front of the saloon with deliberate slowness, tying his reins like a man with all the time in the world. He was clearly enjoying the attention, savoring the fear his presence caused. His cold eyes swept the gathered crowd until they found Clara. A cruel smile split his scarred face. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. "If it ain't my little schoolmarm." He tipped his hat in a mocking salute. "I've missed you, Clara, missed you something fierce." The crowd shifted uneasily. A few men stepped forward, but nobody dared make the first move. Crow had a reputation for being quick with a gun and merciless when crossed. Samuel moved, placing himself squarely between Crow and Clara. "You got no business here, Crow." The outlaw laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the morning stillness. "No business? I came to collect what's rightfully mine." His eyes locked on Clara again. "Unfinished business, you might say." "That business finished 2 years ago," Samuel said, his voice calm, but carrying steel underneath. "And it ain't starting up again." "And who's going to stop me?" Crow took a few steps closer, his spurs ringing against the wooden planks. "You, cowboy? A man who can't even pay his own debts?" Across the street, Mr. Hargrove watched from his bank doorway, a thin smile playing at his lips. He was clearly enjoying the spectacle, waiting for events to unfold exactly as he'd planned. Samuel didn't take the bait. I won't say it again. You got no business here." "My business," Crow said, his hand drifting toward his holster, "has always been with the lady. Always will be." That's when Clara found her voice. "I got no business with you," she said, stepping out from behind Samuel. Her voice shook slightly, but it carried determination that surprised even her. "Never did." Crow's laugh turned harsh. "Oh, but you did, darling. Remember Cedar Falls? Remember how you ran? How you hid in that church like a scared little rabbit?" "I remember," Clara replied, lifting her chin. "I remember a coward who could only pick on defenseless women." Crow's face darkened. The crowd held its collective breath. "Coward?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "We'll see who the coward is here." But before Clara could respond, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Callahan stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face set with determination. "The only coward I see," she said in a voice that carried across the street, "is a man who terrorizes women and children to feed his own twisted pride." Other voices began joining hers. Thompson nodded grimly. The blacksmith's wife spoke up. "We've heard about you, Crow, about what you do to decent folks." The crowd was changing. What had started as fearful observers was becoming something else, something united. Crow's eyes darted around, realizing the dynamics weren't what he'd expected. "This is between me and her," he snarled, jerking his head toward Clara. "No," said a voice from the crowd. It was young Harper, the nervous boy from the ranch visit weeks ago, but his voice wasn't nervous now. "This is between you and all of us." More voices rose in agreement. The community that had once whispered about Clara behind closed doors was now standing with her in broad daylight. Crow found himself facing not a terrified woman and her lone protector, but an entire town that had decided they'd had enough. Samuel felt the shift too. He straightened, drawing strength from the support around them. "You heard them, Crow? Time to ride out." "Like hell," Crow spat, his hand moving fast toward his gun. But Samuel was faster, not with a weapon, but with something more powerful. He stepped forward and caught Crow's wrist before the gun could clear leather, his grip like iron from years of ranch work. What followed was brief but decisive. Samuel wasn't a gunfighter, but he was strong, experienced in hard labor, and motivated by something deeper than anger. He was fighting for love. He twisted Crow's arm, forcing him to drop the weapon, then drove his fist into the outlaw's jaw with a crack that echoed across the silent street. Crow stumbled backward, blood trickling from his split lip. He tried to reach for his fallen gun, but Thompson kicked it away before his fingers could close around it. "Stay down," Samuel warned, standing over the fallen outlaw. But Crow wasn't finished. Crow writhed, then a flash of steel. He pulled a knife from his boot, slashing wildly as he lunged at Samuel. The crowd gasped, several women screaming, but this time they didn't just watch. Young Harper, his face pale but determined, tripped Crow with a well-aimed foot, sending the outlaw momentarily off balance. Samuel capitalized instantly, a primal roar escaping his throat as he wrestled Crow's knife hand. The two men spun, a blur of struggle. Samuel's rancher's strength meeting Crow's street-fighting viciousness. Samuel took a hard blow to the ribs, grunting in pain, but his grip never faltered. From the crowd, Thompson shouted encouragement, while Mrs. Callahan, with surprising speed, hurled a heavy wooden bucket, momentarily distracting Crow. Samuel seized the opportunity, twisting Crow's arm, forcing the knife from his grasp with a sickening snap of bone. The weapon clattered to the dirt. Then, with a surge born of desperation and the silent support of the town, Samuel drove his fist into Crow's jaw with a crack that echoed across the silent street. "It's over," Samuel said, his breathing steady despite the fight. His voice was calm, clear enough for the entire town to hear. "She's not alone anymore, never again." Crow writhed under Samuel's weight, his face red with humiliation and rage. "This ain't finished," he spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." Yes, it is, Clara said, stepping forward. Her voice was stronger now, filled with a confidence that had been building for months. It's been over since the day I stopped running. Aikmare. The crowd began to close in, not to help Crow, but to surround him. Men, women, even some of the older children formed a circle around the fallen outlaw. They had seen him reduced from a terrifying legend to just another bully lying face down in the street. Mrs. Callahan was the first to speak. "I think the gentleman should be moving on," she said with authority, "before we decide to have a longer conversation involving rope and a sturdy tree." Other voices joined hers, creating a chorus of agreement. The community that had once lived in fear of Crow now saw him for what he really was, a pathetic man whose power came only from others' terror. Samuel finally lifted his boot from Crow's back. The outlaw rose slowly, wiping blood from his mouth, his dignity in tatters. His eyes swept the hostile crowd, looking for any sign of sympathy or support. He found none. Even Hargrove had vanished from his bank doorway. "My horse?" Crow mumbled. "Take it," Samuel said, "and keep riding. Don't ever come back." Crow mounted in silence, all traces of his earlier swagger gone. Before spurring his horse, he cast one last look at Clara. But there was no threat in that look now, just the impotent rage of a man who had lost his power to intimidate. "This ain't the end," Lee said, but the words sounded hollow. "Yes," Clara replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "It is exactly the end." Crow spurred his horse hard and galloped out of town, raising a cloud of dust that slowly settled in the morning air. The crowd watched him disappear over the horizon like they were witnessing the end of a nightmare. When the dust cleared, Clara realized something fundamental had changed. People weren't looking at her with fear or suspicion anymore. They were looking at her with respect. Women stepped forward to shake her hand. Men tipped their hats respectfully to Samuel. Mrs. Henderson, who used to cross the street to avoid Clara, now smiled warmly. "You showed real courage today," she said. "Both of you did." Clara looked at Samuel, who still stood where Crow had fallen, his hands slightly trembling from adrenaline, but his eyes steady and calm. He had fought for her. He had risked everything for her. And he had won. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Clara felt truly protected. Not just by Samuel, but by the entire community. She wasn't alone against the world anymore. She had found her place, her people, her home. As the crowd began to disperse, families talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, Clara took Samuel's hand, his fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong and real. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," he replied, "for being worth fighting for." In the distance, dust still hung in the air where Crow had disappeared. But here, in the heart of Wyoming, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with them, Clara and Samuel had found something worth more than safety. They had found belonging. The battle was over, but their real story, their life together, was just beginning. Victory over Crow was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Wyoming community, once divided, began to heal. Mrs. Callahan planted the seed. That girl needs a proper school. Thompson, the rancher, and other men brought wood. Samuel worked alongside them. It was a miracle in slow motion. Families who once avoided Clara now helped her. The school, a simple but solid building with windows that captured the morning light and a bell, grew. Aunt Margaret brought family belongings. Books, a globe, a small chalkboard. "Your mother would be proud," she murmured. On opening day, half the community attended. Clara, beside Samuel, wasn't nervous. For the first time in years, she felt at home. The school flourished, teaching not only children, but adults. Samuel, with community support and his restored reputation, began reducing his debts. Hargrove, isolated after his complicity with Crow, lost his influence. Years passed. The marriage of convenience blossomed into mutual respect and genuine love. On an autumn evening 5 years later, Clara and Samuel sat on the porch. Clara held the restored music box. "Do you remember your promise?" she asked. Samuel smiled. "I said I'd wait to see joy in your eyes." Clara opened the box. The melody filled the air. Her eyes shone with happiness. "You don't have to wait anymore," she whispered. The song played, a hymn of belonging. Far off, the lights of the school shone. Rejection transformed into belonging, pain into hope. Did this story touch you? How many times does true strength come from unity? If you believe in second chances, in communities that choose courage over fear, and in love, stories that prove sometimes the best comes to those who have waited the longest for something real. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiration. "Samuel," she said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never found each other?" He looked at the life they had built. "No, because some things are meant to happen. Some people are meant to find each other, even when the whole world seems set against it.